The Rise of Patriarchy. One often wonders, how did previously egalitarian societies become the rigid patriarchal caste-based societies of today? Plato's Socrates says that it comes about from the need to get things, as he builds his city of 3 souls from the city of pigs, though he disavows any form of sexism in its construction. Others think it be from more intensive labor, and others think it came about as defense. Some put the rise of technology and agriculture as the cause, but agriculture was created by the gathering women, and technology tends to make sexual differences unimportant, so that is not a good explanation. Footnote on technology tends. Emphasis on tends, as this may also exacerbate. End footnote. Well, my empress, I will show that it was predicated on the pre-existing sexual division of labor, which was accelerated by war, and then this thing took on a life of its own, long after it became a Theteron production. There only appears to be a progressive march of history, but all that there is the struggle for resources. When the gods had come to the materium, they found that there was a sexual reproduction system already in place, wholly distinct from what they were used to in heaven. Broadly, though the scholars have shown that these categories do not work under extreme scrutiny, there are male and female sexes amongst these creatures. Various different species started to display sexual dimorphism, which is the physical differences between the two sexes, though the degree of which and the differences between the sexes varied from species to species. And when the gods started to shape the materium via nature, they found that the new beings, the mammals and the birds, and other such animals, also displayed this trait. Of course, examples of faithful monogamy among birds prove nothing about man, for the simple reason that men are not descended from birds. We must instead study the sexual nature of each of the 7 mortal races, and then we must analyze what this means as they develop. Let's be general first. Mortals receive a soul sometime between birth and toddlerdom, and it is at this point that the child is binded to their parent. Usually, this is the biological parent, but in many cases the babe and the parents are unrelated. This ritual is what determines the parentage of the child, rather than the ones who sexually produced this being. The binding ritual is sort of like when certain animals have just given birth and imprints on an animal of a different species, or vice versa. For example, the mortal feels no connection to a child they just produced without this ritual. That is, they feel for it the way they would a stranger's baby. Footnote. At most, this will be something that they plan on binding to, and so their death carries the sorrow of a stillbirth. Don't forget that a gulf separates the attitudes of societies with high and low infant mortality rates. End footnote. No matter what, the child starts to take on the appearance of their binded parents. However, a child always inherits the mythic ancestors, dragons, fairies, empyreans, and so on, of both their biological parents and their binded parents. Any species mixed with a mortal becomes known as an onan, and being an onan may skip generations, even hundreds. Onans are mortals, but with extra potency and powers. At this point, everyone in Cristo has onan blood, but is not necessarily an onan. Note well that the repeated mixing of elves and Nephilim produce Rakshasas. If a child is binded to the parents of a different race, the child does not become that race. The exception to this are the hobgoblins, for a child must be both sired by and binded to a hobgoblin to become one. Thus, if a babe's parents are both hobgoblins, but they are binded to another race, they become that race instead. If the child is biologically descended from 2 races, but is only binded to parents of one of those races, then it becomes the race it is binded to. For example, if a child is biologically the child of an elf and a human, but is only binded to humans, it becomes a human. Furthermore, this child is, quote, purebred, and only counts as a human for ritual and breeding purposes. If a child is biologically descended from 2 races and is binded to both races, that is, it is sired by and binded to an elf and a human, then it is a half-breed. Ritually, the half-breed counts as both races, but as the child enters puberty, the adolescent must start to make choices. Footnote on puberty, which, except for dwarves, occurs around the years 12 to 14 for all races. End footnote. These choices and trials will cause them to fluctuate between the characteristics of both races until the question is settled. They will count as their chosen race and be their chosen race. The exception to this is if a child has a hobgoblin parent, both biologically and ritually, in which case they will always be hobgoblins. Hobgoblins are always purebred, but they may ritually count as any race. If this half-elf, half-human chooses to be a human and has a child with a human, that child will be a human. But if this half-elf, half-human chooses to sire a child with another half-elf, half-human, even if this other chooses to be a human as well, this child will count as a half-elf, half-human, and will be presented with the same choices and trials throughout puberty. Thus, there are groups which are true breeding half-breeds. The Hellenes and the Maya are both instances of this. Humans have very little sexual dimorphism relative to the bulk of the animal kingdom. The scholars somehow managed to quantify this, and they quantify it as 15%. There are distinctions resulting from the distribution of testosterone and estrogen, and men tend to be a little heavier and stronger than women. It is clear that men and women's heights, weights, muscle mass, etc. follow distinct normal distributions. However, the standard deviations are so high that a significant amount of men are actually weaker than the average woman. In addition, there are tendencies for certain hormonally influenced brain patterns to respond well to certain triggers. That is, the culture surrounding an activity may encourage or discourage those with high levels of estrogen or testosterone. This is not to say that some social action is necessarily male or female, but that upon socialization, the technique to get a male or female to behave a certain way does rely on specific biological predispositions. Besides, people tend to associate with those who think like them. However, it must be said, what it means to be a male or female varies so greatly from place to place that these ideas are primarily due to early sex segregation and child rearing. For humans, gender is not a thing that came from a divine tradition, but developed from the sexual division of labor, which developed out of their sexual dimorphism. Humans also have situations in which there are hormonal problems with the individual, and they require special herbs to correct these issues. These people are of a different sex than what is commonly associated with their gender, but they are universally well accepted by their gender as long as this is established during their binding ritual. Footnote: if this happens later, this is referred to as being, quote, transgender. These individuals seek to change society's understanding of their individual gender. It is related to, but distinct from, those who seek to bend society's rigid gendered expectations of their specific personage. Parallel to these people are those who do not personally but politically seek to change gender roles. These things are sometimes accepted and sometimes derided. It is sometimes accepted yet subversive. Just like romantic and sexual relationships with a person of the same gender, it depends on the time and place. End footnote. The person born with female sex characteristics is now a masculine. The person born with male sex characteristics is now a feminine. This happens to a small percentage of the population, and priests of all religions are granted magics to identify this during preparatory work for the binding ritual. These people are raised as that gender, and are fed special herbs. As such, they develop the social habits and physical averages of the typical member of their gender, with variation, of course. The humans of Cristo do not care about a person's sex, but their gender when using pronouns. While a human usually has a preference over which sex they are attracted to, most social pressures which expect certain gendered relationships are blind to the sex for these souled beings. Thus, a mere story is not enough to identify such individuals. Humans also produce those who do not fit either role, called the Bisu, and typically these people are hermaphroditic. Commonly, they become raised slightly outside the tribe, and are seen as a holy person and a mystic. Other times, they are prostitutes. But as we shall see, the dichotomy of sacredness and prostitution comes later. Let us not fool ourselves into thinking this sexual division of labor, in these primitive times, meant that women never hunted, or that men never gathered. In fact, mortals did not hunt for much of the Third Age. They mostly scavenged. When they did hunt, it was more like glorified harassment. Perun was a lover of the one who created the human. So, when he created the halfling, he did it in a way imitating the human. Thus, it was made such that they too have two dominant genders correlated to the two sexes, have those whose gender does not align with the gender typically associated with their sex, and have this third gender, the Bisu. However, they have almost no sexual dimorphism. The male and female halfling are, on average, as tall, fat, and strong as each other. Their sexual dimorphic traits are mainly superficial. The main feature is that the halfling males can grow beards, and halfling women usually have very large breasts, not only proportionally bigger than the other mortal races, but absolutely as well. Footnote on grow beards. Of course, some halfling women can, like certain human women. End footnote. The scholars give controversy on the origin of the halfling's gender. Is it something decided by the mystics and priests, a tradition passed down from Perun, or is it something decided by their soul? Or perhaps the spirit world has influence over it? Some have suggested biological factors, which then opens more questions about why they don't consume the herbs. Regardless, when the babe receives a soul, the priest determines its gender and how it is to be raised. Most of the time, the halfling's gender corresponds to their sex, but it does happen that a halfling will be assigned the social roles of a man when it has female genitalia, and vice versa. We should note that in the majority of the Third Age, the halfling gender system meant nothing more than a gender division of labor. The sexual division of labor, then, it seems, was suggested by Perun's first rituals. The rest of what gender entails happened organically. So, consequently, halflings do not take the hormonal herbs originally because it did not impact their sexual division of labor. The elf has very little sexual dimorphism. Elven women and men are on average the same height, weight, and strength, and are taller than the average human. The elven female typically has very small breasts. The elven male can grow some facial hair, but it is wispy and weak, and when compounded with their androgynous features, it looks very ugly when not tended to. The elf male will have to spend a lot of time on his beard for it to look any good. Footnote: most elven societies actually go beardless, but in those that don't, it is usually reserved for the masculine men. The feminine man may sprout a mustache. End footnote. The elves have a 4-gender system, and the genders of which we call the masculine men, Oroane, feminine women, Makkunrai, masculine women, Kalalai, feminine men, Kalabai. About 1/4 of elves are Orane, another Makkunrai, another fourth Kalalai, and the remaining Kalabai. It's pretty much evenly distributed. Typically, an elf will stick to this gender for life, and in certain societies, they are forced to. On a purely biological basis, elven reproduction requires exactly 2 males and 2 females. But socially, a priest will usually refuse to bind a babe to their parents unless the family is of this gendered form. Footnote: as we shall see, certain religions will abrogate this requirement. End footnote. These genders all play distinct roles in society, each playing their own ceremonial and social role. But typically, the activities of the masculine men and masculine women, the Orane and Kalalai, overlap, as do the activities of the feminine women and feminine men, the Makkunrai and Kalabai. So it is not always incorrect to simplify elven society to a bigender one, of masculinity and femininity, though I will follow the elvish tongue and my pronouns will reflect the sex of the elf, not the gender. Since the elves have very little sexual dimorphism, and since these genders are all delineated across sex, they do not take the herbs that humans consume. The sexual division of labor is a ritualistic one passed down from the Saren. It is not reflective of typical average sexual abilities. In a sense, each role needed to be fulfilled by someone, and the priests arbitrarily picked who would do it. The rest of what gender entails was developed by history. Elves biologically require 2 males and 2 females to make a baby. While monogamy can produce a half-elf, the production of a full elf is different. In order to reproduce, there must be 2 separate sperm cells that come from 2 separate elven men. The zygote becomes an embryo, the embryo a fetus, and it spends a year in gestation in one woman's uterus. Then, after this year is over, a ritual is painstakingly performed over the course of a day that teleports this fetus into a second woman's uterus. If this rite is not performed after around a year, a miscarriage invariably occurs. Thus, the existence of the elven race presupposes ritual. The fetus grows in this other woman's uterus for half a year, and then it is born. Half-elves need no such transference, but a half-elven pregnancy lasts 4 months longer when compared to the normal gestation period of their other race. While one could think of a familyless arrangement, elves, unlike humans, always had a family unit, though later faiths, like Islam, would alter their form. This is because after the Blood Flood, Silvise actively enforced this relationship among elves as he reconstituted the Saren. So, they identify each member of their marriage with the first iteration of the Saren, regardless of their current faith. The Orane is identified with Silvise, the elven Allfather, and is seen as the warrior and judge of the family. The Kalalai is seen as Aoife, now the Morrigan, and is charged with the cultic practices of both society and of those unique to this particular family. The Makkunrai is seen as Artio, and is tasked with interactions with other families and the administrative matters of the family. The Kalabai is the laborer, and is identified with the Wanderer, now Alot. Collectively, unanimously, They make rules for themselves in the traditional way of an elven democracy. These rules are not so strict, however, and in practical reality are fluid. Only an arch-conservative would even attempt to fully live by them, if they could even be surmised. For what Silvise enforced was simply the basis, as he stopped imposing this during the Lyre, when he stopped repairing his sacred groves. The gnomes have sexual dimorphism at about the level of humanity. However, the gnomes are too anarchic, too liberated, too strong-willed and free-spirited for this to affect them, though a male gnome might on average be stronger than a female gnome with a high degree of variation. They never paid this any heed. Gnomes follow the path they want to, not necessarily the one they are good at. The gnome who is strong may refuse to utilize this. Instead, they may spend their time on less intensive activities. The gnome who is weak may be the warrior, the hunter. The very idea that gnomes should have a sexual division of labor based on dimorphism therefore never occurred to them. Their natural curiosity and their desire to take command of their own destiny well outweighed the practical considerations other races might value. Certainly, Kunirama did not care enough to impose these relations on them either. Though a gnome biologically reproduces through sexual reproduction, though their sexes are distinct, they never developed a sexual division of labor and therefore never develop gender. Gnomes do, however, sometimes take herbs that impact their hormonal development. They see this as a way to control the aesthetics of their body and their temperament, to change the way they look and interact with the world, not for any reason of conforming to a gender. The dwarf reproduces asexually. An iron dwarf crafts a child out of iron. A lead dwarf, the Lazood, does so through lead. Footnote: usually they have someone else do this crafting for them. End footnote. Their god, Siddhic, Seric, or Lycaer, breathes life into this being and actually imparts it with the soul at its moment of birth, and so there is no need to do the parental binding. The parental binding is this ritual, and it is done by this god. The dwarf does not have sex at all, so it could never create a sexual division of labor. The dwarves do look distinct. This is not the same as sexual dimorphism. Thus, they have never experienced this rise of patriarchy. Their class system, as it were, was directly handed to them by Siddhic and developed in the First Age. If this seems strange, recall that they were cut off from the world throughout most of their prehistory. Orcs tend to be very violent individuals, short of thought and quick of wrath. They expect many to conform to social codes that they themselves can't articulate. When presented with something new and confusing, their first instinct is to get mad. They look a bit like pigs, hence the other races tend to utilize them as law enforcement. Such things are prevalent among all the other races, but especially so with orcs. An orc can integrate well within other societies and religions. For example, Hellas and Grycia are populated by what is essentially a true breeding race of orcs and lunar elves. Anyone can overcome such violent inclinations. Some religious background, some aversion to curiosity if they are helped. In some regards, these cultures suffer from the orc. In others, they are also benefited by these strong and sturdy people. It averages out. Besides, it is not as if an orc can't be a genius or a pacifist. As I have said, there are cultures which utilize orcs as the police, like Vitaliu and Fitzhudor. Usually, these orcs are not integrated, and if they are, they act as a sort of minority group from which to draw bodyguards, gangsters, and cops from. Haruk Bator does not approve of this so much, but he tolerates it. Quote, "It puts fear in the heart of all the other mortal races when they even hear the word orc." End quote. Then there are cultures, like Enskanza, which do not integrate orcs so much, but which have a high propensity towards forming diplomatic, personal, and romantic and sexual relationships with orcs. The vast majority of orcs are feral orcs, which is a derogatory term, but they like and embrace it. They herd boar and ghast. They live on the outskirts of civilization. They are far enough away to tend to their horticulture and pastures, close enough to raid, while a charismatic leader can unite these semi-nomadic peoples beyond their immediate territory. This is a distrusted activity and is actively undermined by their gods. The Trasgo pantheon of Haruk-Bator, Rokthol, Thrunch, and formerly, but sometimes ritually, Milligarn, will send angels and whispers if this situation persists. Quote, "Why's he giving the orders?" End quote. Quote, "This guy isn't very killy." End quote. Quote, "He's not so tough. Get him!" End quote, etc. So, local autonomy is enforced, as their religion discourages anything more complex than the brutal personal relations of force. Even when they are united, it is nothing more than a loose confederation, each vying for its own interests against the rest. While they do not have the infrastructure to be totalitarian, this is no principled anarchy. A feral orc polity is a very violent one based on bondage, slavery, servitude, and cold-hearted rule. This is how Haruk Bator likes it, and it is part of why your son, Uruk Karan, betrayed his father. With all these considerations, it is no surprise that the feral orc society is patriarchal, but with a twist. Orcs are themselves hermaphroditic, but still display sexual dimorphism. They have papillas and cloacas instead of penises and vaginas. For the orc, their gender system is referred to as cur and bitch. The cur displays exaggerated male features. They are taller, darker, more muscled, and generally meaner. Throughout their life, their cloaca becomes permanently engorged by their papilla. The bitch, on the other hand, varies. The common type is shorter, a little fat, big-breasted, and generally wider. Their papilla becomes the size and shape of a pea. Useless. They are also the ones who give birth. The less common type displays a more youthful, boyish look. Lithe, short-haired, flat-chested. Typically, their genitalia is that of the cur, though smaller. While the second type can be called bitch, and sometimes is, this typically refers to the first type, and this lithe, boyish orc is more commonly called a twink. Throughout their prepubescent life, the orc oscillates between these three paths. It is influenced by the way the rest of the tribe perceives them, through their actions, and what desires the individual will have. The orcs do the parent binding ritual. It is a more community-wide endeavor for them than for most, and the gender is not revealed. Gender for the orcs is something an individual acquires through their words and deeds. Penetration, hunting, raiding, exercising, trash talk, and games of strength and endurance. These are all the things necessary for the orc to become a cur. Footnote on penetrating. The opposite, of course, is reserved solely for the bitch. End footnote. The more manly, or the more boy-like, or the more womanly the tribe finds the orc to be, the more manly, boy-like, or womanly the orc becomes. Typically, this transition is finished by the time the pup enters adulthood at the age of 14. It is expected that the cur owns many slaves and takes on many bitches. Indeed, he tries to hoard them and prevent others from acquiring any bitches. Sometimes, he tries to bitch a rival cur. The cur himself has a sexual monopoly on his bitches, and may even go so far as to prevent them from talking to those outside the family. The bitch is expected to groom the cur, to cook for him, to raise the children, to be sexually submissive in all ways, and to take care of other such domestic matters, while the cur hunts, drinks, feasts, and lazes. He typically does not love his bitch, and typically the most he can find for his children is pride in some son's strength. He rules through fear and whip. There is one semi-autonomous bitch in the tribe. The head shaman, the most mystic of the bunch, is a priestess of Rokthol. This witch is always a birthing bitch with a fanged underbite, and typically belongs to the chieftain. No one can beat her, for she brings great power of healing and harvesting. Sometimes, not even the chieftain is allowed to take her virginity, or to plow her once she has been chosen. She is not only a powerful, and therefore scary, magician, she is also essential to their limited, orcish horticulture. Though she wields no direct political power, she is an incredibly influential figure in the community. Orcs, unique amongst mortals, classify whom is the active and passive partner not through mere acts of position or whom is thrusting, but penetration. Footnote on active and passive partner. Though not all cultures of the other races make this distinction or prioritize it. End footnote. In orc parlance, to bitch someone or something means to penetrate it. In social contexts, orcs will always view this as an act of domination upon another, an exertion of themselves, and a humiliation. Even to their bitches, for the feminine genders are bound to their cur, but not the other way around. To bitch someone and to be bitched are completely different things. Some orcs simply shame the cur who has been bitched, while others also find the one who has humiliated a fellow cur in such a way to have committed a grave transgression. Some are so severe and barbaric that they think the shame that this has brought about is so severe, so spiritually and cosmically important, that the death penalty must be applied. Oftentimes a highly public, communal execution like stoning or burning. Sometimes, only the one who has lost his masculinity must be sacrificed. For other orcs, the very spirit of masculinity has been violated by this performance, and the penetrator must be killed in revenge. A few demand both have brought about impurity in their own way. Yet, many orcs simply look down upon the bitched cur, but don't necessarily remove his status. Yet privately, many a cur has felt a secret desire and has made their twink penetrate them. They may even play into the bitching taboo, but if word gets out, or their twink even so much as accidentally stumbles across a sore spot, they will quickly become violent and wrathful in their shame. Now, the hobgoblins. The hobgoblins are a different story entirely, as they actually form an aristocracy in the literal sense of the word. Each hobgoblin is trained since birth to be the sole ruler of their territory and to see every other hobgoblin in the area as a threat to their power. Even in the Third Age, the hobgoblins asserted themselves as chiefs in what would otherwise have been egalitarian societies. So, at most one hobgoblin and their brood will occupy an area. Hobgoblin country simply means an area that is ruled by a hobgoblin, and invariably finds the hobgoblins in the minority.
There is no notion of a half-hobgoblin.
For any creature descended from a hobgoblin and bind it to a hobgoblin is itself a pure hobgoblin. Any creature only descended from hobgoblins and never bound are pure hobgoblins, and anything else is the other race they are binded to or born from. Hobgoblins consequently count as any race, for most ritual purposes, notable exceptions being the secret of steel and true agriculture. Hobgoblins also tend to avoid mating with each other, in the same way and for the same reasons that mortal races tend to avoid incest. Footnote. Emphasis on tend, for this is a tendency, not an iron law. End footnote. Hobgoblins do have sexual dimorphism, though usually a little less than humans, but more than halflings. When a female hobgoblin births, it births a litter. When a male hobgoblin impregnates, the females of the other species birth what is normal for her species, complete with the normal amount of variation. A hobgoblin female can be simultaneously impregnated by multiple males. However, the hobgoblin gender system is completely and totally distinct from the sex. The hobgoblin lord, both masculine and feminine, has a harem of other mortals and goblins that they will breed with. This lord will wait for a wandering priest, maybe a sibling they had sterilized at a young age, to come and bless the babe when it receives a soul. This is also when the hobgoblin receives a gender, though there is some debate among the scholars if this is revealed by the characteristics of the soul assigned by Meligarn or just assumed by the priest. The chief hobgoblin, the parent, is expected to be involved in the raising of the child and is expected to groom them for succession, to train them to know they must kill or exile or maim their siblings. The parent acquires tutors to teach their brood, and this tutor has a vested interest in their pupil's continued survival. For a hobgoblin, early childhood is not just a time of play, but a time of quickly changing political alliances, of knowledge that out of you and your ally, there can only be one. Think what this does to the young hobgoblin. For them, even something like an apology becomes a weapon against your siblings, a sort of thing to collect. An apology belies a deep, serious humility and desperation. The apology becomes something that is offered, but impolite to take, something that is demanded from a hateful rival, or given to a hurt ally. Hobgoblin children are usually left to their own devices, but are segregated on the basis of gender. When raising them, the chieftain likes to emphasize different things. All are taught the importance of mathematics, literature, and ritual, when they have these things, as well as other practical advice for rule. But men are typically taught to make bold investments. Women are taught to keep a more balanced book. Men are taught the logistics of warfare. Women are taught the logistics of peace. Men are taught to be strong negotiators and aggressive. Women are taught to rule by tricking the ruled into thinking they are part of this greater thing. Men are taught to extend their sexuality assertively and aggressively, to take what they want. Women are taught that, outside of their harem, their sexuality is a tool to be used, a trap to ensnare others. Men are taught the ways of bow and arrow. Women are taught the ways of wand and staff. In practice, though, there is no different inclination towards peace or war,
intimidation or diplomacy,
skills with swords or skills with power words, or lust or chastity between the genders. Very rarely does someone display zero traits associated with the opposite gender, and very rarely does someone display all the traits associated with their own. In practice, you couldn't, because the whole expectation of hobgoblin gender is usually a contradictory mess that is completely situational. Even after being raised like this, these things really do not vary too much among the hobgoblins, and oftentimes, a feminine hobgoblin will be more aggressive than a masculine hobgoblin, who may be more conciliatory. But when hobgoblins are around other hobgoblins, or the issue of gender comes up, it is like they are compensating, like they are compelled to conform to these abstract ideas. It is here, under peer pressure, that the hobgoblin really starts to conform this way, to perform the way they think a man or woman should. So, we see that in our discussion of patriarchy, we can really only talk about elves, halflings, humans, and orcs. We have no need to discuss orcs, and elves develop patriarchy in a different way than another mortal would. While the elven peoples already come split up into family units, the humans and halflings had to develop this. Originally, the human and halfling had no idea of things such as incest or pairing. There was no restriction on sex between the old and the young, or with close relatives. No one knew their birth father because of how often sex was passed around. The binding ritual was simple and involved the entire tribe, with the mother occupying a special role. Footnote: this is one of the reasons the gods cursed us with postpartum depression. Instead of simply designing a being that would help, they created this roundabout and oft faltering scheme where we would feel sorrow for the depressed person and assist them. More to the point, we would see that they are incapable and step in to help the babe. Thus, child rearing would not be a single person affair. End footnote. And this distinction itself helped give rise to gender, which is itself a manifestation of the division of labor. Since the one who gave birth was singled out for binding, the female and not the male was given a specific role in society. But then, also, wet nursing, for some women cannot, or will not, breastfeed, and someone else must come to occupy this very special role, which was of course highly ritualized and mythologized then, and for obvious reasons. In almost all cases, the wet nurse is female. The herbs may help, and not all females may lactate easily, and some who can't develop shame abated by the existence of the wet nurse. But it takes much more dedication, training, and resources. And thus, a correlation between femininity and womanhood was observed, but the soul reminded the brain that this was a mere trend. All the while, the spirit spread and reinforced this division in other ways. Child rearing is a labor, after all, and one of the most important ones, and it takes many more than parents to do so. It takes teachers, kin, and indeed, other children. We must remember that our ancestors did not practice communism because it was a good time, because they sat around the fire and sang Kumbaya, with all the vibes in place. No, it was because they believed this was the way to maximize their individual wealth. They had to eat in common, and they really couldn't afford slaves. Nor did they have the things that made a thrall a worthwhile investment. But, as they advanced and could produce more and more wealth, they began to hoard these things. It is only natural for a mother to want better things for her children, and so, steps were taken to ensure that this wealth, this limited wealth, would be preserved for them. I don't need to qualify why this is so, but for those who point out favoritism, or mothers who toss aside their newborns, it is true that a child costs resources, but also that a superb child can bring resources back. Hence, the gens formed, and when it became unmanageable, it became a phratry, with gens subdividing it. It was based on the principle of female succession. One was in the gens of their mother, and belonged to that gens. The gens could regulate its own affairs, to an extent, and started to look at the broader tribe as a confederation. They began to elect permanent chiefs to settle disputes between the gens, or to lead them in war, which requires iron discipline and courage. This is not to say there were opposing classes. No, there was merely a wealth disparity. At the same time, the wealthier tribes were also the ones that avoided incest. Why they developed the mechanism to avoid incest is for a myriad of conflicting reasons, too vast and varied to mention here. One implication was that there became a prohibition on mating inside the gens. Another was that the union of two people became formalized, though there may be multiple such unions. But now, they knew who the father was, at least ritually, and they knew who these people they could not have sex with were. Their parents, and later, their siblings. We will see there will later be pressures on the rich and the elite classes to rediscover the practice of incest, to really cement the fact of the father, to better regulate sexual activity, which was forbidden inside the gens. The tribe altered the binding ritual. It was now to include the father. Some even went so far as to invent marriage to better regulate this sexual behavior. In humans, this was not handed down to them from a god, but invented. But as this arose from the old mode, inheritance into a gens was still determined through the mother. As wealth became more important, jealousy started to take over the minds of other tribes. How could it not? If I am starving and you have plenty, I will take from you. Raiding increased, and warfare became more and more important. Consequently, the warriors became more and more important. By inducting a warrior into the gens, one could better protect their properties and interests. Since men constituted the majority of warriors, the power dynamics started to skew more in favor of men. At the same time, alliance became ever more important. This was done through marriage and through the hostage system. Footnote: Hostage can have a bad connotation to it, but a hostage system is more or less an exchange program. The threat hanging over the hostage is real, but typically, they are usually returned when a treaty is broken. Instead, hostages are treated quite well, for it gives the other court an in if some insider remembers the land fondly and waxes nostalgic on the way they were treated. End footnote. Thus, children increasingly came to be viewed as pawns in their parents' game. It was no longer about passing on what you think to be the best to your child. It was about using them for your means. Hence, they were to be loyal soldiers, to obey you in all things. Already here, children are not to develop into their own real person, but to simply be carbon copies of their parents.
It was through warfare, then, that men started to become the dominant sex. In many cases, women retained their voting power, and while they could not become the chief, they had some role in nomination. Footnote on voting. Though this was too informal to be proper voting, still, even in the Roman Republic, voting is an ad hoc process. End footnote. Sometimes, the male and female leadership would cooperate. Other times, they came into conflict with one another. Some social happenstance might allow the male or female leadership to weigh in on the controversy of the day. The leaders of the males asserted the right of men to control their wives, though even here, he would not call for a ban on divorce. He asserted that it was the man, and not the woman, that should instruct the children. He diminished the role of women in their society. He prevented her from fighting to further delegitimize her claims, and to reinforce her specific role. He may even have lied and said he believed women were not subservient, just different. Quote, "Women hold half the sky," end quote, is still a statement of segregation, of distributing the different halves to different people. Now, this push may have been catalyzed by some specific squabble between a specific male and a specific female, or it may have come from a happenstance of men gaining leverage over women. This revolt, or more likely reform, may have succeeded, it may have failed, it may have been a specific case that didn't set precedent, it may have been overturned. It may have happened overnight, or taken centuries. Even today, we see in some hunter-gatherers that women are not able to speak to men outside their family. We see in others that women raise their arms alongside the man. We see there are some places where women can rule, sometimes through their sons, sometimes in their own right, and other times where a woman doesn't even have the right to remove her own clothes in her own home without her husband's permission. Many times, this occurs in the same place and time. See Semiramis. The sad reality is, though, before the change in astrology of the Fifth Age, the women had to be lucky every time, the men lucky only once. This conflict, this rise of the patriarch, is one between two groups of people, each motivated by a quantity of economic factors that became a quality in and of itself due to its scale. It is an open conflict of war and politicking, in a system which has given men a privileged role. Change might not even be possible. The economic factors at play could lead to a societal collapse, either due to internal conflicts piling up too high or because an enemy might exploit a weakness. Change is also limited by the fact that if you find yourself doing things a certain way, there are only a few ways you can change things. Even worse, there must not only be an incentive, but also a compulsion to change. Patriarchy expresses itself in different ways. The same sexual relations in different contexts sometimes indicates advancedness, other times backwardness. Let us say a given society organizes sexual relations in some way, but in some broader context. Then we explore all possible variations they could pursue, given what is feasible. We eliminate the ones which do not promote certain interests, or what the incompetent think their interests are. We look at all these changes. Any of these changes that spell doom for that society might be pursued, but then that society won't last. If there is more than one road, then these things are determined by the relative strengths of two sides. For we must never forget that women will fight back, that their victories are simply ignored by chroniclers and poets. While this would be augmented for many cases, it became a duty to have children. I do not mean for the whole, which is so obvious it should not need to be said, but each individual. This is because children are the mode of networking, and society can't function unless everyone plays along. But what about those of the halflings and humans who had entered into a relationship with a person whose gender does not align with the gender typically associated with their sex? They could not naturally have children. Thus, a right was discovered specifically for this case, the right of surrogacy. Both partners have to be otherwise fertile, for these magic herbs do not impact the fertility of those who take them.
They take either their menstrual blood or their sperm, and they pour it into dirt until it becomes mud. A priest blesses water, and then this mud is used to make a kind of tea. A woman in both sex and gender, whose womb may carry children, will then consume it. This is the normal rate of impregnation. But this child that she carries is not her own, not mythically, not biologically, and she swears by an oath she would only raise this child if the standard analog would compel her to. That is, she is in their will, she is a relative, etc. The priest then performs a rite on her that would have her regard this babe as none more than the babe of these two. The child is bound to them. This rite fails if these conditions are not met exactly. The parents must be of different genders, the surrogate must go willingly, the two must be fertile, and so on and so forth. While a priest administers it, it seems to be a spell from the spirit world. But the spirits here are silent to those who don't master heaven. However, in space, they have figured out a physical medical procedure which is banned here. Footnote, not because it is surrogacy, but because it is a technology. End footnote. In the meantime, those of adelphopoiesis must adopt, as they are of the same gender. Who is this surrogate? Sometimes she is a close friend or family member. Other times, she is a prostitute. The meaning of how she is to be regarded and what her station is varies in both time and space. There is another factor that both influences and is influenced by patriarchal relations: inheritance. As the gens passes through the mother, the father cannot pass on his things to his children. They are not of his gens. At this early stage, even the patriarch is beholden to his gens. The gens demands that they retain what is theirs. When he dies, it reverts to his gens and passes on to his sister's children. Now, unless the father marries up, something strongly discouraged in these societies, it is his sons that have an issue with this. They were raised in their father's network. They were made to be loyal to him. They were used as his pawns. They became him. Yet, where is their reward? This change occurs less when inheritance issues are involved and more when political factors are at play. It is when one's position in the clan becomes hereditary, even if only informally, that this really explodes. Hence, this change occurs especially around the time a society becomes advanced enough to support classes. My father's slaves, they should be mine. I should take them over. My father's clients, they should be mine. Matrilineality can be retained if the gens which benefits manages to rally against the gens which gets the short stick. But all of these factors come together, especially, even if only incidentally, the father's control over the children, and lead to the establishment of a patrilineal system. For a time, a woman will still be her father's property in some way, even after she gets married, but then there are cases where this too will be severed. Sometimes, economic circumstances may allow her to reverse this and remain as her father's property. Footnote, in Rome, this will be the, quote, better option, end footnote. Other times, it is the reverse. In many places in space, we have actually seen women blow up this situation. They become legally equal to men and formally economically independent. But on this planet, it is complicated, and we shall explain when we get to it. Here, the patriarch finally solidifies control over his family. His children are totally his. There is no doubt. The binding ritual is rewritten to exclude the community. It is just the parents. At this stage, the father has a monopoly on his children even though she raises them. Adultery becomes the greatest sin his wife could commit, as it embarrasses him. It casts doubt during the binding ritual, and furthermore, it gives him a lack of control over the wife. He gains Kagari through her actions, but how much depends. The patriarch holds life and death over his family, his slaves, his estate. He becomes the monarch of his own state, and is placed inside his gens. He uses the gens to his advantage, while seeking autonomy from it. The state is formed to collectively manage the interests of the gens, the patriarchs, and to mediate the interests between them. The state grew out of the old government of people, which regulated madness and mediated relations between the tribes, which dealt with the individual deviants. The state arises from class conflict. Class conflict in its earliest stage of slavery and clientage, which arose out of war with foreigners and farlanders, necessarily compounds all these tendencies we have seen. Once we get to the level of separate classes within one ethnic group, that is, once we see the state, we will inevitably see patriarchy, and then, eventually, patrilineality.
It is conceivable to imagine a world where we have a slaving society but no patriarchy. Well, we've played this game enough times to make bold declarations. Class and patriarchy develop together. This is not to say a class society will not destroy patriarchy, for we simply have to look at our empire in space, and by the Fifth Age, the very meaning of patriarchy will be changed. For these things do not simply develop and then end. They are constantly in flux. It is only with Cristo's blessing that a time period could become static. They change themselves, mold themselves. They reify what they have learned, but they don't follow these new dictates. So, even by the process of trying to follow the system, they change it, as kinks are worked out and new things emerge. Two things may have come from the same starting point, but followed different paths. It is a bit of a random walk, but this is mainly due to exposure to different forces and limitations. For patriarchy is not simply a conspiracy against women by men. Women engage in it, and mothers teach their women and men to behave these ways. Mother-in-laws act as spies for their sons, reporting their wives' activities. We see that women are actually granted small benefits to engage with patriarchy, though these benefits are minuscule
compared to what they could achieve if they revolted against this system.
It is easier to attain. The logic makes sense in a way. Say if you pick option A, 99% of the time you get severely beaten. 1% of the time you are given treasures and are freed. Say if you pick option B, you get beaten, but 30% of the time they lick your wounds after. Which would you take? Unfortunately, most choose wrong. It is through this mechanism that a slave in body becomes a slave in mind. They are duped into thinking that option B is not only the safe choice, but a kindness granted to them. They are duped into collapsing unrelated interests and arguments into each other. They genuinely believe they are following their own interests because the system is smart enough to give them bread and circus, though it makes budget cuts every year. We could even see that patriarchy becomes augmented by interactions with different people. This isn't so simple as a mere, quote, exchange of ideas, end quote, but something much deeper. Perhaps one law code gets adopted or imposed on another for whatever reason. Perhaps they form alliances which necessarily augment their society. Perhaps their interaction has its own implications. One society may be less patriarchal than the other. It may even say, quote, I must liberate the women there, end quote. This could work, and the women could welcome it. Or the more liberated society may be exploiting the patriarchal one in different ways, masking their true intentions, even if a few really believe this is what they are doing. The women might react harshly, associating the destruction of their traditional culture with all manners of abuse. They would then certainly wear symbols of patriarchy with pride, and follow it more stringently than ever before. What a mess they would be leaving their daughters and granddaughters, and yes, even their sons. It could even be that one society becomes jealous of the other. They had no idea they could treat the feminine genders this way, and they lament that they can't. But this may also be a nonsense joke. For example, the Romans believed that a woman should always argue with a man, but that the man should ultimately win. The patriarch's son, and to an extent, even the patriarch as a person, is not benefited by this system. He too is oppressed, though to a much lesser degree. He had no choice in how he was raised. He was used as a pawn and forced to be his father. He becomes violent and arrogant and pompous. This authoritarian rule, this view of other people, it gets in the way of love. What kind of people are we raising when love does not enter into their calculations? How could they ever hope to be happy?